I'm delighted to be joined by Deric Henderson and Allison Morris. What I want to do right now is to just take a look at Reporting the Troubles. And this is an amazing book, 72 accounts of Reporting the Troubles. It's not a book that you would sit and read in a single go. It's a book that you read a story and it absorbs you. You reflect on it and you move on to the next one at a later stage. As one of the co-editors, why did you go for this book, Deric? Why did you write it?
I'd finished my career as a full-time journalist, and it was my son actually. He said, "Dad," he says, you know, I was brought up in a house with a parent who was a journalist. During the worst of troubles, you were never here. You were always away. You were too busy. You know, Mum had to look after us because you were so tied up with your job. And you know, you must have met an awful lot of journalists in your time, and people who'd become friends. And he says, "Why don't you do a compilation of articles, or get your friends to write articles about what it was like working in Belfast?" And it sounded a good idea. I was busy, but not that busy, and Ivan Little and I mean, we started in the Belfast Telegraph together. He was there a couple of months before me in '73. And we had written a book privately, a private commission. We just finished it, and I said, "Well, what do you think? Do you fancy this?" And he says, "Yeah, why not?" And of course, we know so many journalists. So there was no great thought behind in terms of who we should get. So we started doing, he took 30 names, I took 30 names, and we just phoned these guys and girls and said, "Listen, would you be interested in writing this or doing this book?" And, you know, without exception, was one or two people, and for good reason, said, "No, listen, I don't fancy this." And everybody just embraced it. You know, we told them that, "Listen, there's nothing in this, because you know, there's nothing, you don't get anything for writing books," and you don't. Despite what people might think, you don't make any real money out of it. But it was the way people embraced it, and that was the nice thing about it. And friends, guys you'd worked with. We decided then again, last year during COVID, why don't we do a second volume? And again, we drew up a quick list, and you know, a lot of people were obviously working from home, so it wasn't hard to get in touch with people, and people like Allison Morris. You know, it was just the way people said, "Okay, we'll do this," because it's not so much a book; it's a project. But you know, this is part of the storytelling process. It gives people an idea what it was like during the bad old days in Belfast. Thankfully now it's a much changed city, such a nice place now. Not without its problems, but it's a much different place. It should be in a better place, and unfortunately it's not. But we decided we'd do the second book, and again, everybody embraced it. They said, "Yeah, why not?" And we had no real difficulty filling the empty pages, and they say there's another 70 names. And I can tell you now, we'll probably go for a third. We'll do the trilogy, and because there are enough people out there who will happily subscribe, and it's something, you know, it's something nice to be part of. It's just, you know, there's some lovely names there, some great names, some names unfortunately are no longer with us, and that's why we're glad to get this. It's basically to get something to get out of our system, and Ivan and I are absolutely delighted to be able to do this.
There's a lovely sequence of chapters at the end of the book that talk about the fact that we haven't yet enabled enough people to tell their stories, and we need to do a lot more of that.
Well, I'd hope, I won't keep you, I would hope, you know, that, you know, it's a storytelling process, and everybody has a story to tell, not just journalists, but everybody, especially those people who were impacted by the Troubles. And they should have the right, no matter who they are or what they went through or what they suffered or whatever it was, right? They should have the right to write their story or tell their story, whatever way they want, to be archived in some way and to be put away and set there as a matter of public record. It's not just about journalists. There are so many people who would love to tell their stories but haven't got the platform that we have. And I think that this process, whatever you want to call it, should be extended and widened.
Allison, your story that you chose for the book was Holy Cross. Why?
That was in the very early days of my career as a journalist. I mean, and as I say in the book, I was no stranger to a riot. You know, I used to walk around burning buses to get to school in the morning. riots, weren't new, but reporting on a riot was very new. By the time Holy Cross came, the world's press landed on the Ardown Road, and they were of all shapes, sizes, social classes. No longer was, security journalism a male-dominated industry. It had changed dramatically in that time. And I think it was because it was my very early days as a reporter. It's one of the things that has always stuck in my head, but not just that, because of the impact it had in that community. So while I read about Holy Cross, I extended out, because that was an entire summer, an entire year of discontent at those interfaces. And we were at the very early days of the peace process, and I came from a very troubled part of Belfast. But already I could see the dividends of peace in my area. I could see things changing. And a couple of miles across the city, nothing had changed at all. And so it was a story that had always stuck with me, because I say in the book, there's only 2 times I've ever cried, and I try not to. One was actually speaking to the mother of a suicide victim who had been sexually abused by a member of the Catholic Church, and she was in bits and I was in bits by the end of it. And I remember feeling angry at myself afterwards, because it was her story, it wasn't mine, and I had no right to be crying because it wasn't my loss. And Holy Cross was the same. It was just, I got very emotional that day, and I remember being angry at myself for doing it, because we're visitors to that world. We're going in to tell people stories, and we shouldn't be, inserting ourselves. We should be giving them the opportunity to tell it.
Just one final question to you, Allison, about the story, which is you ask in the writing of it, why was Holy Cross allowed to happen? Are you still asking yourself that question? I've
tried to cover it on the 10th anniversary and then look at it again. Last year, I know when we tried to cover it, it was the 20th anniversary of that atrocity. It still baffles me how that was allowed to happen. There's nowhere else in the world would allow a conflict to take place outside a little girl's primary school. And at the time, it was still the RUC, and it would still be the RUC for a few months yet. It wasn't until November 2001 that the changeover happened. The soldiers were still on the street. Had they went in and cleared that road on day one and arrested the main protagonist of that would have stopped on day one. It wouldn't have solved the conflict that was existing in those streets, because that was a much wider issue, and that was an issue that was, there was all sorts of political neglect there. There was, the policing neglect. There was all sorts of things that needed to be dealt with there in terms of sectarian strife outside it. But they should never have been allowed to sit outside that school, and to sit outside it for so long. That went on for so long. And I remember going back and speaking to some of the young girls who had been in that school when they were young women, and they were still, some of them were still on antidepressants and prescription medication. They had been to therapy. They were, terrified to go to certain parts. Whereas my children would have been out socialising in the town with people from all across the city. They wouldn't even have, that sort of sectarian element of staying in your own area had long since gone by the time my children were in their teens and 20s. But yet it still existed, because they were so terrified of what happened to them. They were still living very small lives in their wee enclave, because they were so terrified by what had happened. And I thought the lasting impact of that on that society, and the distrust among neighbours that emerged from that conflict, which is still there. That strife outside Holy Cross still exists. Scratch that and you'll find that, the anger that exists in that community on both sides, because both felt wronged by it by the end, it should never have been allowed to happen. It still baffles me why it was allowed to happen. And remember that, one of the biggest events of all our lives, a global event happened just a few days into it. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers, and after that, it was left to people like me and local journalists who stood up there, went back week after week and were trying to tell a story that, had been going on for so long. You wondered how many more angles that you could come at it from. But once things moved on and there was no global attention on it, I think that there was no political, there wasn't enough, I don't think that the politics of that time had moved on. They were trying to deal with other things. We're talking about decommission and all sorts of other things, trying to deal with policing, and nobody concentrated enough effort into trying to resolve that sort of very local conflict at Holy Cross.
You talked about the need to write the story rather than be the story, but had you been the story, had you been one of those mothers in the story, would you have been able to walk your child down?
My children were that age at the time, and I remember thinking that at the same time. And I would like to think, I remember especially, I suppose, a lot of the English journalists kept saying to the mothers, could you not walk them around the Crumlin Road and walk them around the other way? And at the same time that was happening, there was also race riots happening in England, in the north of England. And I remember thinking, you wouldn't say to someone from the Asian community, why don't you just go to a different shop 4 streets away? Why are you annoying your neighbours by using that shop? You wouldn't say it to them. I would like to think, at some stage, for my daughter's sake, I would have made a stand and said, you should be allowed to walk through the front door. But I think 2 days into that would have been enough for me. You know, it was so violent and so awful. As time went on, the tactics changed, you know, and at one point they were like cutting pictures of the parents out of the newspapers and sticking them onto like hardcore like pornography from magazines and waving it in front of people when they got up, and the children had to have headphones in them for the noise, and it just went on it should never happened, and it went on far too long, and it was just so damaging to the relations in that part of the world, which is already, you know, North Belfast and interfaith communities already live with enough problems without having to live with that as well.
Absolutely so. Deric, over the years you covered a lot of heartbreaking stories, but in the book, in Reporting the Troubles 2, you decided to talk about Leslie Gordon. Why was that?
Well, Leslie Gordon was a 10-year-old girl. She was blown up on an IRA car bomb with her dad. He was a UDR soldier outside her home in Mahara in 1978. And I was working for the Belfast Telegraph at the time, and I was sent up to cover the story. And the next day there was another atrocity, and he moved on to the next story, because that's the way it was. People were being killed every day, every week, every day, every week. But the Leslie Gordon story stuck with me for some reason. I don't know why. When we decided to do the second book, I said to myself, I would like to go back to Mahara and speak to her mother and try and find out who exactly Leslie Gordon was, because, you know, I didn't really know who she was, what type of wee girl she was, you know, what her hopes and dreams were. And her mother, who's now in her 80s, welcomed me into the house, and she was astonished that somebody like me, who'd been in the media for over 40 years, would come knocking on her door after all these years, 40 years later, to say, well, I want to know about your daughter. Tell me about Leslie. And she was, well, why would you want to know for? I said, because I want to know. I want to get this again out of my system. I want to find out what this wee girl was like, and tell me what it was like the day she died. And it was quite emotional. She, her father was reversing the car out of the side of the house, and Leslie was getting ready to go to school with her brother, and they were picking up a couple of other kids. They went to a primary school outside Mahara, and she reached up to her mom and she says, Mommy, I love you very much. She ran out into the car, got into the front seat beside her dad. Her dad reversed out. There was a tripwire, and suddenly the car went up. Now, we have a fair idea who was responsible for what happened that day and who carried out that explosion. But this piece wasn't about the people who did it and why they did it. We all know why they did it, right? This was about Leslie Gordon. Who was she? What was she about? You know, she deserves her place like everybody else. And again, as Allison says, it's all part of the storytelling process. Here was a lady in her 80s that, you know, that she thought we'd all forgotten about. And we had. But when I went knocking on her door, she stood back. She couldn't believe it, that this total stranger would suddenly appear on her doorstep and make inquiries about, what was your daughter like? So it was something that I got out of my system, and this something for this lady as well, to release herself of all the pain and all the, you know, the bad thoughts at the time about it. And that's why Leslie Gordon for me was so important. I mean, I've covered far, far bigger stories, but that to me was something I wanted to do.
What occurred to me overnight was that between us, we have over 100 years of journalism in this room. Isn't that
terrifying.
It's terrifying. And has it made us any wiser, Allison?
I think I'm a lot wiser now, and probably the way I approach stories and the way I approach things. You know, you're very gung-ho at the start, really, and I did things that probably I shouldn't have done, and that's why I'm glad that I'm still here, because there's times I did things when I look back, I would never advise any young journalist to do that, because it was just dangerous.
And Deric, are you any wiser?
Oh yeah, a lot wiser, but I mean, the landscape has changed, not beyond recognition, even since I retired. And, you know, I'm an old-fashioned print journalist. I mean, that's where, you know, that's my great love, is print. Just seeing the steady decline, and you just begin to wonder, will regional newspapers still be here in 10 years' time? I don't know. I doubt it, and that's what I would worry about.
But I mean, think about from the time, when you have started, and even the time when I started after that, how many times we had to adapt our style and adapt how we sold newspapers. It's all part of the process. I think it will always exist, but we just have to be really creative and innovative, or I do think that, we're in trouble. But there'll always be a market for proper news, which is what I try and do, stuff that you cannot read anywhere else, that kind of news.
I'm going to go back to before those days, back to the start, and check with you, Deric. What took you into journalism in the first place?
Well, I can remember the day exactly. People talk about being touched. I mean, I was touched in an Orange Hall by a guy called Neil Johnson, the late Neil Johnson, who was a reporter in the Belfast Telegraph. But we were at a table tennis tournament in Donaghey and I, Orange Hall in Beera, 10 miles outside Omagh, my hometown. And Neil Johnson and I were both playing in a table tennis tournament. And during a break in the match, I said to him, "Tell me this, what do you do? What do you do? What do you work at?" And he says, "I'm a reporter." And I said, "Right." And I was 14 at the time, but I went to the local newspaper and I said to him, "Would you mind if I come in here and work during the summer holidays?" And I says, "You don't have to pay me, I'll do it for nothing." So I worked 3 consecutive summer holidays in the Tyrone Constitution, and they offered me a job in August 1968. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And for the first time in my life, I think it was something I was completely focused on. It was the one thing in my life that I wanted to do. And when I got a job in the Tyrone Constitution, just as the first stones and bottles were being thrown on the streets of Belfast and Deric, I knew I had made it. That was my route. So it was in an Orange Hall where I was touched.
An amazing story, Deric, and you obviously had the determination, you had the skills, you had the application, you got the breaks as well, and you were lucky to meet Neil Johnson, so that was fabulous for you.
I'm forever grateful to Neil Johnson.
Allison, turning to you, where did you start and why?
Well, I grew up in West Belfast, and so, newspapers and journalists were all around me, but all around me covering the conflict that existed outside my door. You'd have read through the stories, and I used to think that wasn't reflective of my community. People coming in and reporting on something from the outside, they were painting my community in a way I felt was very negative, And I remember thinking, there must be a way of telling that story in a different way, and it was something I wanted to do. And I had been trying to get onto the journalist course and was told it was very competitive to get onto it, and so one day I get into my car and I drove over to what would have been the old Biffy building in the Ravenhill Road, and went in and spoke to Alan Whitsitt, and he probably thought, "I'll just get rid of this wee girl and she'll not come back again." And he said, it was 10 o'clock in the morning, he said, "If you're back here by lunchtime with a work placement, I'll give you a place in my course, because we've no work placements. So I've dished out all the work placements we have, so I don't have one for you." So I basically get into the car and I went to the shop. The only, the newspaper which had been closest to my home would have been the Andersonstown News. I bought a copy of it in the shop and I looked down the inside and it said editor, his name, and I walked up to the building and asked to speak to him at the front desk, and he came out and I said, "I'm in a real hurry, but this guy says he let me on this journalist course if I can come back with a letter saying that I can get a work placement in the newspaper. Will you take me?" He seemed a bit shocked and just went, "Yeah." He signed a bit of paper. I went back over, it was about 12:30, handed it to Alan Whitsitt. He burst out laughing and he says, "Go and take a seat, you're on the course." And that was basically it.
Looking at the massive experience that you both have and the great starts that you both had to your careers, what are the stories that spring to your mind that you covered that we're not going to talk about in the book? Give me one example, Deric, of a story that really grabbed you.
There was a story about a donkey that went missing in North Antrim. It was such an innocuous story, right, that suddenly just caught fire. Yeah. And every journalist in Fleet Street was sent up to the North Antrim coast to see if they could find this bloody donkey. Right? So, I mean, and it was a story that didn't excite me. It interested me, right, but it didn't excite me. And remember, this is way back before Good Friday. This was going back, around even before the first IRA ceasefire in '94, when things were, the only news from Belfast that ever made the front page was some atrocity or whatever, right? And suddenly the switchboard lights up. As I say, every journalist in Belfast that, with who were working to a London office or to a London news desk were sent up to the North Coast. And Dennis Murray's never forgiven me for that.
Did he ever find it?
No, at all. Nobody ever found it.
Wonderful, wonderful story, Deric. Thank you for that. Alison, what about you? Story for you?
Yeah, it's true. It's true what Deric's saying, because sometimes you'll put your heart and soul into this big news feature and you'll be so proud of it, and then you look at, because we can see in analytics now what people are reading, and they'll be reading something, because people need light and shade. You know, newspapers need light and shade. It can't all be heavy news all the time. But it's the people whose homes you go into who open their door to you when something awful has happened to them. And you know, I'm doing crime and security, so these people have undergone a tragedy, and it never fails to amaze me how gracious they are that they'll bring you into your home, they'll make you a cup of tea, and they'll tell you the story when it's at the worst point of their life. And then afterwards, you know, I've met those people and they have thanked you because they've went, you know, you told people what my son was like, what he was really like, that he was a person, that he was loved, that he was, you know. And I think as a journalist, if you can do that, it's those ordinary stories. So, you know, especially when we're talking about legacy of the Troubles, there's so many victims who have never had their story told. Nobody has ever knocked their door to speak to them. And you know, there's times when you do knock the door and they do sit you down and they do start telling you about their loved ones and what happened to them since. It's a real privilege, it really is. You write the story, you don't be the story. You know, never put yourself at the centre of it. You don't put the person you're interviewing at the centre of it. And I think that that's such an important, you know, it's stuck with me through all that time. You know, when I'm there writing that story, it's not about me, it's about the person who has opened their door to me and has trusted me with their story.
It's that receptiveness that helps you do your job properly. Where can we get the book?
I mean, all good. I mean, it's in bookshops as from today. Obviously Amazon, and I mean the first print run. I think it's 6,000 copies is gone, yeah. And I mean, it just people will be interested because there's such a wide. You know, Allison's first news editor, Robin Livingstone, Squinter, writes about Scapitici. And you know, there's you know, there's such a divergence of you know, Maggie O'Kane, who was one of the Guardian star writers here. You know, her first encounter with Johnny Adair.
From Malachy O'Doherty, from Roisin Macaulay, from Jim Gracie. Surprisingly enough, I'm not into sport, but I loved the story about the football match. Michael McMillan, which, you know, given what he'd covered, the story he chose is an absolutely amazing story. Colin Bateman's retreat from journalism to novel writing, a very smart decision, but a very interesting story.
Mark McFadden, for me, of UTV, is probably the standout piece. For me, anyway, it's basically about the bodies of the victims from Omagh, the Buncranic children being brought home that night. And Mark doing that piece. And he's exhausted. It's 3 or 4 days into the story, and he's absolutely out on his feet. And he's got kids of his own the same age, and going back at home that night, and going into their bedroom. I mean, that's a very powerful piece. David
Linus, for me, summed it up and sums up actually how I'm feeling right now, because I'm actually in touch with those memories right now. Was that David Linus says at the end of his book, he says, we, unbeknownst to ourselves perhaps, we were all too close to what happened over those years.
You know, going in and like actually smelling your children, do you know what I mean? To see, you know, and feeling that care that you have, and you know, and just gratitude that you were able to leave that behind. But also, I think it's very hardening for you as a person. I think it's hardened me. I don't know if it's hardened you. And you know, sometimes I think that's not a good thing, to harden yourself too much to the sorrows of the world.
I think the advice you got in the early days, don't be the story, write the story, was good advice, but you have to feel the story to make it work.
Journalists need empathy, or else, you know, you can tell in their writing if they don't have any empathy for their subject, and it really shows.
Deric, Allison, I have to thank you very much for a fabulous contribution, and we wish you every success with the book, Reporting the Troubles too. Thank you both very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Mike, for having me.